one, action. Hello, welcome back. This is Show and Tell, and I'm your host, Billy. I can be found on Ravelry and Instagram as billietoy, and I'll put that right here on the screen for you. This is a vintage knitting program. Usually I podcast every week or so, give or take. And sometimes I have guests, and today is one of those days. So I'm going to be joined in just a moment by Jules, who's in Germany, and she's going to tell us more about where she is. And she's going to show us some of her knitting, which is a little different than what you've seen here in the past. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. Okay, we're back, and I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to actually let Jules introduce herself and tell us where she's from. And as I ask all of my guests to please tell us something about the city or town where they live that if we were tourists there, we might not find on our own. So take it away.
Hello, thank
Hi.
you so much for having me on your podcast. So I live in Bremen, which is a city in northern Germany. And we have a very strange tradition here. It's not a place, it's an activity that you do in the winter. And I'm quite sure tourists don't know about it because it's just too weird and too local. So if you come to Germany and you want to do this, you have to first make some new friends and get them to invite you to go with them on a Kohlfahrt. Kohl is cabbage. In this case, it means Grunkohl, which is kale, and Fahrt does not mean fart. It's kind of like a journey in a broad sense of the word. So you could call it a kale hike or a kale tour. And this happens in the winter when kale is growing in the fields all around here. And what you do is you get a bunch of your friends together, and at least one of them will have a little pushcart wagon, which you fill with bottles of schnapps. And then you go outside and you walk around through the countryside. This is in like December, January, so it's cold. It's probably raining. The weather is utterly miserable here in the winter. It's not even that really freezing cold, but just cold and damp. Yes?
Excuse me 1 second. So schnapps, for people who might not know what that is a very high alcohol content liquor. Is that right?
Yes, and there are some, it can be any kind, but there are some local varieties here which are very strange. Some of them are green, they all taste terrible if you ask me, but you put a lot of high percent alcohol in this little wagon.
So
and
it's
then you go out,
and it's going to warm you up on the coldest day.
Now you're getting it. So you walk through the countryside where kale is growing in the fields, probably. And of course, as you say, it's cold and miserable and you need something to cheer yourself up. So you drink a lot of this alcohol. Because it's Germany, of course, there are rules about drinking the alcohol. You play stupid games like throwing tea bags, or you have to roll the dice, and then you have to drink at every intersection and at every bridge and all these silly things. So you do this for 2 or 3 hours until everybody is thoroughly drunk. And at this point, you've wound up in some little village where you go to a restaurant and you eat Kohl und Pinkel, which is a regional specialty dish. It's lots and lots of kale, boiled for a long time with lots and lots of meat. Pinkel is a kind of sausage that's a specialty from here. It's very good, actually. It's delicious. It's got kind of grains and interesting spices mixed in with the sausage. So you eat lots and lots of Kohl und Pinkel, you drink a lot of beer, then you drink some more schnapps, and then you elect the Grunkohl king and queen. Sometimes those are the people who have eaten the most, sometimes it's the people who have drunk the most, and their job is to organize this activity next year.
How about toss
So
the
if you
most
come to
cookies?
Bremen in the winter, this is the true local experience. Don't ask me, because I did this once and I hated it. I hate cold weather. I hate hanging around with drunk people. I don't drink alcohol. I'll go to the restaurant and eat because the food is really delicious, but it's crazy tradition and very, very local.
So I said, how about the person who tosses the most cookies? Are you familiar with that expression?
possibly that person could also become the Grunkohl king or queen, depending on the rules of your group. Yes.
So as soon as you said Bremen, it made me think of those fairy tales. Aren't there like the three musicians of Bremen or something? Is it
Four? Yes, the Bremen
four?
town. Yes.
And
yes.
who was that?
That's it. That's our city.
That
Yeah.
Grimm or somebody else?
Grimm. Yes.
Grimm. I vaguely remember, and you mentioned bridges. I'm sort of picturing this fairy tale where the men are at the bridge, or maybe I'm thinking of is it the Three Billy Goats Gruff, where there's somebody at the bridge? Is that also Bremen?
No, the Bremen town musicians there are four animals. There's like a horse and a dog and a cat and a rooster, and they're going to get killed by their owners because they're old and not useful anymore. So they decide to run away and go to Bremen and become musicians. And then they also walk through the countryside, lots of countryside around this city. And instead of eating kale, they stop in a house overnight where there are robbers, and they scare away the robbers. And in the end, actually, they end up living in the house, and they never really get to Bremen, but they're happy. So it
sounds so quaint. I mean, any town that a fairy tale is written about must be just charming and adorable. And you mentioned bridges, so I'm envisioning all these cute bridges, little old stone bridges. Anyway, we got really off on a tangent. We came here to talk about knitting, vintage knitting in particular. And I think you might be my first guest who is not steeped in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I think you're somewhat later. So yeah, tell us about your period of interest, and then please start whenever you're ready to show us some of the things that you've knit.
Well, I mostly knit things from the 1960s. That's my favorite period of vintage fashion. And when I started collecting vintage knitting magazines, I kind of got stuck on Stitchcraft, which many of your viewers will probably know, especially from the earlier decades. And I ended up collecting the entire 1960s of Stitchcraft, 120 issues, just of this one magazine, and of course, lots of other magazines and things from the 50s around it, but specifically these 120 issues. And a few years ago, I started a blog where I talk about each issue in order. I write one post about that month's issue, and then I make one project from that issue. It can be a small project. It's not always a whole sweater, but make something from each issue. And I'm now in the third year of knitting my way through Stitchcraft. So that's really just deepened my appreciation for 1960s knitting. And this that I have on right now, this is the very first project that I made for the blog from January 1960. This herringbone green was very much in fashion in January 1960, and herringbone was very early, like around 1960. There was a herringbone trend. So I made this wonderful thing. And what I like about it is not just the herringbone and this juxtaposition of very bold colors, which is something I associate with the 60s that you didn't have in the 50s or the 40s, where things are sort of more subtle or more dainty in some ways. The 60s, you start getting these bold colors and bolder shapes that I just think is fun to wear and fun to knit. And it has these little details, like these big collars. Also, it went in and out throughout the 60s, but we're in a 1960 collars, button collar. I just thought that was a really fun.
I'm remembering. Sorry to interrupt you. I'm remembering my father in the 1960s wearing a tuxedo, and the men's dress shirts at that time had big collars or ruffles. I mean, it was a very bizarre fashion period. So it's interesting to hear you talk about it because I was there. So I have in my memory bank how I dressed, how we dressed. I would love if you would stand up if you could.
Oh, sure.
Show us.
And I'm wearing with a plain black skirt. So
because I think it's really indicative of the period that you love. The colors, the houndstooth, the big collar, as you described. But I wanted to see all of it. So thanks for showing us.
Right. Well, what is vintage? I mean, I went on a little tour of secondhand shops a few weeks ago, and I was horrified to see that the vintage stores, there were things from the 90s, and I think, no, the 90s, that was yesterday. But of course it wasn't. But I was born in the 70s, so for me the 60s are vintage because it was
Right,
before my time.
right.
So yeah, I can see that it's a different perspective. It's interesting when you have things like the 1920s. Most people who are alive today were not alive in the 1920s, or if they were alive, they were quite young. They were not adults. So that's really vintage in a way that the 1960s aren't, because you have people like me who were not alive, people who were young people then, even people who were middle-aged people then. It's an interesting thing. So speaking of very 60s, what's something people think about when they think of 1960s fashion? They think of this sort of Chanel suit, this kind of boxy, you have a shorter skirt with a, sort of square blazer. And this is the blazer from a wonderful suit. I haven't made the skirt yet. This was, I think, from 1961, 2 years ago. Again, a sort of herringbone pattern. And I like this because you could make it really tailored. Like I put darts in the back. I kind of folded over the shoulders to make a sort of, not quite shoulder pad, but to give that really square shoulder feeling. And it's got that very tailored look. It's the use of braid here to finish off the edges instead of ribbing. Little pockets. I learned how to set in pockets by knitting vintage things. So this is also one of my favorite things, and it's very warm. This is made in Shetland wool. I was at Shetland Wool Week 2 years ago. Absolutely fantastic festival, and of course you can buy all the Shetland wool direct from the people there, and they have this great kind of marled tweed that gives this very sort of Chanel look. But this is also from Stitchcraft, for example.
What are the buttons made of?
The buttons are modern buttons that I bought in a normal store. I don't know if you can't really see it in black. They are covered, I'm sure underneath they're plastic, but they're covered in sort of fabric, almost as if you had wound.
They're great. They're perfect, actually, for that, in my opinion.
I've bought vintage buttons on eBay too. I mean, you can get everything on eBay. It's at this most wonderful place for vintage anything, because somebody is always clearing out great aunt's attic, and then I mean that's where I got all my knitting books, my Stitchcraft books from UK, eBay. It's just a wonderful marketplace, I find.
That was so great, the black and white. It's so classic. I mean, the colors are classic. They never go out of style. Black and white, navy and white perennially are in fashion. Also, the tailoring of it, it just seems like every single year from 1961 until today, you could wear that jacket and not look like you were dressed in something weird.
Right. It doesn't look costumey. I mean, it looks like a classy blazer. So and very warm. Very nice.
Great choice. Great choice.
So one of the other things I really like about vintage knitting in general, of course, this is not 1960s, you have them in the 50s, 40s, 30s, but it did kind of go out of fashion after the 60s, is the whole concept of a knitted blouse. Just the idea that you have a fine knit garment that buttons up the front, kind of high buttoning up the front, and that you wear under your suit, instead of a blouse, for cold weather. Obviously, the weather in 1960s Stitchcraft England is quite comparable to the weather that I experience here where I live. And it's amazing how much, in a damp climate, how wonderful it is to wear a very fine knit wool shirt, a wool, you don't even necessarily need to wear a long t-shirt or anything under it. And I don't know that as a modern thing. If I go to modern stores, you can see, sweater, jumper, pullovers, you can see a cardigan, jackets, but I don't see really fine knits that are made to be worn as a blouse. So this is something that I made. I think this was from 1960 or 1961. a little blouse. You can see this has still some of the 1950s shape. You've got the 1950s shape, which is a kind of shorter and ends at the waist, as opposed to the typical 1960s, which is kind of more casual and straight up and down and goes down to the hips. So this one has a more nipped in waist. And this was interesting because it was written for fuller figures, which I don't have, but I was interested to think of the shaping on it. And it actually has bust darts, which is very rare for, you know, in vintage knitting. Most things, some of the earlier things, you know, the 40s and 50s, they have the front larger than the back, which kind of does a sort of bust dart effect. And these days, most people who make bust darts would do it with short rows. But this was written where you actually cast off on the side and then start casting back on, which I didn't do. I made it with short rows because I'm lazy.
And then you sew it together.
And then you sew it up. Yes.
So it's more
really
like
making sewing. Yeah.
it's more like a sewn garment as opposed to a knitted garment construction.
Yes, the darts are done by sewing. I did it with short rows because I just thought that would be easier. But I thought it was turned out very nice, and it has these little inserts, and the inserts are crocheted. So that turned out very nice. And I used a very fine alpaca wool, which is very, very light, and it makes something that I can just wear as a nice blouse or wear it under another blazer or something if it's really cold. And it's just a brilliant idea and the perfect thing for this kind of climate.
It's a super interesting construction. It must have been great fun to knit those insects.
Yes, and it's a dome. That's the other thing. It's made in a sort of dolman sleeve. I mean, it started at the bottom. It's supposed to be knit in pieces. Of course, everything is written to be knit in pieces, but I knit a lot of things in the round or cardigans, you know, back and forth, all the pieces together to make it easier. But the sleeves are cast on and knit horizontally. So they're not knitted vertically
like this
from the cup. Yes, exactly.
I started like here and knit across.
Oh, no, not like that. This
not like that.
It starts at the bottom and you knit up to here, and then
you
cast
and then
on 2, and then you cast on 4, and then you cast on 10, and another, and so on.
Gotcha.
And then you cast off to get the shoulder shaping.
Now,
so
where this crochet, where the crochet panel is it sheer behind that? Is like, are you seeing through that area?
Yes, I can. Oh, it's hard to see because
I just saw the light come through. That's what I thought. When you were holding it up, the darkness of the back was coming through, but it is all open work. Ooh la la. Yes. So you have to wear something under that as well.
I do wear something under it, yes, but in the original picture, I think the crochet is a bit tighter or something, so there's less showing. But of course, you wear something under it anyway. It just doesn't have to be a big heavy t-shirt. It can be a simple
camisole
or something. Yes. So I really like this. It turned out to not fit me perfectly because it really is meant for someone who has a fuller figure, i.e., a large bosom. And I realized when I made it, because of the darts, the front is really longer than the back. I personally am not longer in the front than in the back, so it doesn't fit quite well. But I remade it last year for a friend who has really the right figure for it, and it looks so good on her. So this is a really good design for especially people who are shorter and curvier, really perfect design. One other thing I made, or one thing that I like doing, I also design knits. I don't always write down designs and sell them. I have sold a few, but I like just designing my own things to make for myself or to make for other people or custom work. And there was one project from the blog. It was a little jacket for a little girl, also in a slip stitch pattern, which was a big thing in the 1960s. These 2-color or even 3-color slip stitch patterns, also gone out of fashion since then for the most part. And the picture was in red and white, and I made it in red and blue for her, and it looked so fantastic and so electric in the colors. I thought, oh, I should make something for myself in this pattern, which is very 60s when you think of the fashion of taking things which were meant for children and adapting them for adults. And there's this big trend of you know, wearing these short skirts and with the knee socks and then things that were children's wear, adapting them for adults. So I turned that pattern into this dress, and this great red and blue. This is also very, it's not vintage wool, but it's very historically accurate wool because it's very synthetic. I don't always like working with synthetic yarn. I prefer real wool, but this is really good for this kind of thing because it holds the shape very well. And you can wash it and it doesn't stretch out. So I made myself a mini dress based on a 1960s shape and based on a stitch pattern that I had used in another vintage thing. So,
is it A-line?
Yes, it's hard to see holding it up here, but
I can imagine, but yeah.
Yeah, and at the hem, I made a sort of hem for the bottom, and then the hem, you know, it was a knitted hem, so of course it rolls up if you don't sew it under. But then I decided it actually looked good with the rolled hem, so I just let the hem roll up and did a little crochet edging for the rest of it. And again, modern buttons that look like little blue flowers. You never know what you find.
Well, flower power was really a thing.
Yeah.
There were a lot of flowers, psychedelic flowers even.
Yeah, I'm not in the psychedelic years yet with the blog. I'm on the 1963. So, you know, right, 1960 and 1961 are kind of continuing.
It's not Vietnam yet, right?
No, not yet. Or, you know, not the swinging 60s for British Stitchcraft. It's not quite that far yet.
Right, no Beatles yet. The Beatles weren't until 1964.
Right.
So they arrived here.
We're just starting there. And fashions, the mid 60s fashions, you have mostly a lot of bulky yarns, which is not so much my taste, and a lot of kind of big casual things in bulky yarns. So yeah, that's in the later years. Then you start getting into the mini dresses and the more wild things. Yeah. Although there is a crazy project I'm working on right now. This is the blog project for this month. And every project is an experiment. There are some things that I've, you know, not done before, some techniques. I've also gotten into embroidery and needlepoint because of this blog, which is not my specialty, but I've been learning. And I also think it's fun then to adopt some of the embroidery patterns for things that are useful in the modern world. Like they have a lot of embroidered tea cozies or things like a thing called a finger plate, which as far as I can see, you put on a door so that you don't smear the door with your dirty hands when you open it. But I don't understand why it's better to clean a beautifully hand embroidered thing than just wipe down the door. I haven't quite understood the point of that, but there are embroidered things that I don't use in my life, so I adapt them for things that are useful in the modern world. Like, well, here I am on my iPad, and this is an iPad cozy that was supposed to be a tea cozy originally, with little
adorable
goslings on it. Anyway, so this month's project is from November 1963. I can show you the original magazine. Here it is. So here's Stitchcraft in 1963. And there was a trend in the mid 60s for hats that had a sort of loop pattern, either knitted or crocheted. Maybe you remember this. I don't know if this was from your time. They look kind of crazy. They kind of looks almost like you're wearing a mop on your head. I mean, it's that hat. Here's another magazine from about the same time, Fashions. This is an American magazine, Fashions for the North, South, East, West. And there's another pattern like that here. Now that my hair is pink, it looks like this if I don't comb it. But this
I certainly remember swim caps, bathing caps that had I don't know what that's, I guess rubber, like rubbery, thin rubbery flowers all over it, just like that you would go swimming in. It's a pity that those have gone out of fashion because that was really fun. You could wear a plain bathing suit and have a fun thing. But now everything is like a Speedo, slick, like nothing for real
Right.
swimming. But this was like
Yeah.
recreational swimming, and it made it so much fun. Unfortunately, after a while, the chlorine, and I guess if you didn't keep it really, really dry, it would kind of dry out like dry rot, and then it would crumble. But modern fabrics have supplanted a lot of these things that were so unique to their time.
Yeah. Although what I like about the 1960s, I mean, of course, synthetic fabrics and polyester, it is problematic in some ways. It is bad for the environment. Okay, this is true. But I inherited a lot of 1960s clothes from my grandmother, and they are in perfect condition because they are made of that 1960s synthetic fabric that does not dye. The color is perfect. It is indestructible. It looks, I mean, I put it on and I look like she looked 50 years ago. So there is something to be said for that.
And the moths are not interested in it at all.
So anyway, this hat, this is supposed to be my project for this month. And it's crocheted. It's crocheted in this interesting loop stitch. You work it from the inside of the hat and you kind of wind the yarn around your finger and do a sort of maneuver with it to make the loop on the outside. So the picture here is blue, but I don't have any clothes in this color of blue. Most of what I wear is black, actually, and almost all of my accessories are black because otherwise I just would have to try to match things and it's too much work for me. So I decided to make it in black, and this is what it looks like so far. Woof, woof, woof. Okay, so the positive thing I see about this is that it reminds me of those lamb's wool coats, and I think you might know what I'm talking about. There was the trend, yes.
Absolutely.
Those lamb's wool coats, the very tightly curly.
Persian lamb.
My grandmother had one of those too.
Persian lamb. Yeah, it was very big, I think, in the 40s, but it continued on for sure, for sure. I'm remembering my mother having a hat very similar to that, and it was black, and she had very black hair, as black as my sofa, and there were black velvet ribbons all around, and when she had it on, it totally covered her hair. It looked like it was her hair because it was black.
That's kind of my worry about this. Like, on the good side, I can imagine if I had one of those Persian lamb coats, which I don't, and I don't think I would have it, it's not really my taste, but I imagine this would be the perfect accessory to your Persian lamb coat. Or in the modern day, if you wanted to crochet a sort of vegetarian friendly fake Persian lamb coat, this would be the stitch pattern for it because it really looks like it. You've got this nubbly, I mean, it would be a perfect substitute, actually, maybe in just a slightly thinner yarn.
It would be fabulous to make very wide cuffs on a jacket, have the collar and the cuffs be that same texture. So it would look like faux fur cuff and collar with the matching. Yeah,
that is a great idea. The disadvantage I see, I mean, we'll see how it turns out. I feel like the way it is now, it might look like a poodle is sitting on my head. Or like white person wearing an Afro wig. These are not the kind of look I'm trying to cultivate. So we will see how this turns out. But what I like about the blog is that not every project it turns out perfectly, but I learned something from every project and from trying things. You know, I'm not a great crocheter. I've never done this loop stitch before. So this was something new for me, something to learn and you know, some way to understand the fashion by making it, which I think is worthwhile, no matter how the project comes out.
Absolutely. I think there's a knit stitch that also gives that poodly effect. I think there's
in the other magazine it was knitted.
Yeah. I thought you said.
I started with January 1960, and at this point I'm up to November 1963.
63. So it's going to get more interesting, I think, as you go. Because I think certainly once the Beatles came into the worldwide view, I think fashion started changing because of their hairstyles, and they started wearing jackets without lapels. They were really creating a lot of fashion. And then in the United States, we were sort of responding to that, and we had these crazy television shows. Laugh-In, Goldie Hawn got her start, as far as I know, in Laugh-In, and she wore very outlandish things. Sometimes she was wearing very little, actually, and they would paint her body, so it looked like she had not really tattoos, but it was like works of art all over her. If some of this is on YouTube, it's worth going back and looking at. It was just really crazy time. And then with Vietnam and protests and the peace signs and flower children, a lot of flower power and psychedelic drugs, fashion really, really changed, as did everything else. Everything.
Yeah.
It
and in fashion,
affected
you have Mary Quant, you have these people who are really doing revolutionary things in their
yes,
time.
in Britain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stitchcraft is a conservative, it's a fashion conservative magazine. I mean, even the later 60s, you can see that they're going with the kind of more interesting trend, but they don't have any Mary Quant designs. I mean, they weren't really out there. Less so than maybe knitting or something. Vogue was more fashion forward than Stitchcraft, which is kind of more for the working to middle class, housewife, family mother, working young woman kind of audience. But still, there's some great. I'm looking forward to some great dresses. Above all, the dresses are really fantastic. These great mini dresses and hat fashions. Nobody wears hats anymore. Well, I do in the winter because it's
I
cold,
do.
But
if you watch my past episodes, often
yes,
I have some.
Wonderful vintage hats. Yes.
You said you have all the magazines right there. Can you show something from the later 60s so we can get a feel for what that was like?
I'll just pick one at random. Here is July 1968. So here, the sort of in Germany, the sort of hippie movement was they called them the 68er, the hippies from 1968. So this was what was going on in Stitchcraft in 1968. You've got these, these nubbly yarns too. Interesting kind of boucle yarns. Here's a more classic conservative thing for a man. Here's a very nice sort of Paris-inspired, this very modern-looking T-shirt. It's a knitted T-shirt. You could wear this anyway. Then you have these very kind of not fashion-forward, but very 1960s brown needlepoint tapestry homewares. And great stuff, always great stuff for children and for young people throughout the board. Beautiful, intricate things for babies and very imaginative things for kids or for young teenagers. Stitchcraft always has some incredible like applique or embroidery things for gigantic wall panels. Here's the entire Chaucer. Here's a great hat. So this is a very
yes.
Very sweet crocheted. This is very nice. I think this is also very nice. It's not, if you ask people about the 1960s, this is not the thing they would think of. They think the late 60s, they think, okay, like you say, the flower power or things like this. But there was also this sort of softer trend.
Well, there was a big
interesting details like the bows.
There was a big look back at the Victorian era. I remember having something with a high collar with ruffles at the top and mutton leg sleeves with more like eyelid and ruffles. So there was a lot of Victorian. It was either, that really mod look, or I think Victorian. So that pink doesn't surprise me with the ribbon and ruffles.
Yeah. Here, okay, I'll pick another one at random. So what do we got? You've got August 1969. So here's a nice kind of couple and partner look. This is something that they started, Stitchcraft started doing that in the earlier 60s, that you have this kind of his and hers same outfit thing. Oh, here we go. So this is the great stuff. This is and the wonderful background of the photos.
Even her pose.
Unlike mine. I could do this look with the hair. What else is in here? Oh, here. So this is really, you've noticed it's 1969. This is really going towards the 70s. You've got this crocheted vest.
It seems like crochet is really coming back. When I go to my local knitting group, some of the younger women are more into crochet than knitting.
Oh, interesting. Well, crochet is fast. In some ways, it's easier than knitting. I find it more difficult in many ways, but I could see that. You can do a lot with crochet. Oh, speaking of, okay, the craziest thing I have ever made, vintage project, is a crochet project. And it's not Stitchcraft, but it was from a Patterns booklet, Patterns Yarn, which also published Stitchcraft. And it doesn't have a date, but it must have been from the early 1970s. And it is this crocheted jumpsuit, which I thought was so fantastic. I thought, I don't care where I will wear this, or if ever, I have to make this. So I did. It's being repaired right now, but I can show it to you. It took forever to make. And then we did a photo shoot. If people are on Ravelry, they can see it on Ravelry, where we recreated the photos from the magazine with Photoshop. So I was both models with a wig. We had so much fun. And
I'll put your Ravelry handle in the show notes so people can find you.
Sure. So this is this crazy thing. And there's always the question, what do you wear underneath this? Because it is utterly see-through, of course, and you can't see what the model is wearing under it. But of course, these days, the other garment that has had a renaissance is this sort of shapewear. So I could actually get like a sort of bodysuit with a bit of like legs to the knee and, covering the top to wear under this extremely crazy disco.
If you're Beyonce, you might be wearing next to nothing under it, or a nude color bodysuit under it.
That's what I have. I have a beige bodysuit, so it really does have that peekaboo nude effect, but you can't actually see anything you're not supposed to see. So that's a good compromise.
Here in New York, we have the Fashion Institute of Technology, which is a very famous school for fashion design and other allied fields. And they have a little museum. And I recently went to the museum. Their theme right now is roses. So they had this black jumpsuit, solid black. And I don't know what decade it was from. It might have been the 60s or the 70s. The lower part of the bell-bottom pant had lace inserts. So it was sheer, but mostly black. And it was stunning. So it's reminiscent of what you're showing. I forget who the designer was. All the things in this exhibit are famous fashion designers, Valentino and Patrick Kelly and Dior, of course, et cetera, et cetera.
Nice. Well, going back to this idea that, vintage times having nostalgia for other vintage times, like in the 80s, there was a vintage idea of the 1940s, shoulder pads and a certain silhouette. And in the 70s, there was also this nostalgia for the 1930s. So I tried to explore that in a project I made last summer. This was another thing that I didn't make from a vintage pattern, but just sort of from an idea of a vintage pattern. I had a lot of scraps of different colors in the same yarn. So I wanted to make something with stripes or something that I could use all this up. And I thought of making something with chevrons, like a nice chevron pattern, because I like that pattern. It was a pattern that was popular in the 20s and 30s, and then also in the 70s as part of the sort of 70s retro 30s thing. So I looked through vintage patterns from the 30s that I could find online, but I couldn't find anything that would really fit with the amount of wool that I had or the number of stripes or whatever. And the colors were more 70s appropriate because they are also sort of kind of electric colors, especially with the pink hair, kind of, you'll see. So I just, again, made my own pattern and made my own design, which turned out very nicely. And that is this chevron top. It's got the little, bow tie at the front and short sleeves. So it's got that sort of 30s styling here, not too long, kind of more waist length. And this, kind of narrow set in shoulders. So I thought that was a nice way to say, is it 70s retro? Is it 30s retro? Is it 70s meta, 30s retro? It's all of those things together. It's just kind of a vintage retro look that could fit in a lot of different vintage ideas or in a lot of different vintage inspired outfits. So yeah, that's also one of the products I very much enjoy.
Glad I don't have to take a quiz because I don't know if I would put that in the 70s.
Well, I remember being a little kid, I had like sort of knitted like vest things in this chevron pattern.
Yeah.
So I had a comeback. I think maybe it wasn't a huge comeback. Maybe it was just a trend that went for a few times. But I associate that with my childhood, or if I see like old photos for me, somebody always had this sort of, it was really maybe not with long sleeves. It was always like a sleeveless kind of over pull.
Right, a vest that tied just here, or like somewhere in
yeah, something like that, and
completely open, but like one little tie here.
Yeah.
Not the prettiest silhouette.
No, I can't wear that silhouette. That's also my problem with a lot of kind of 1940s and 50s designs. I love the designs, it is beautiful, but I have a very long waist and I'm sort of tall and wide and flat chested, and this sort of silhouette that ends at the waist, it doesn't work. I love those 1950s dresses that have the wide skirt, with the to put the petticoat under. I think they look beautiful, but I can't buy them. I would have to sew them myself, because if I buy them, the waist is way up on my ribs. It never works. So I either have to get better at sewing or
well, that's the beauty of knitting, that you can really make it. I guess people who sew well can do the same, but knitting is so forgiving. Really, if you have a problem figure, as I do, and many other people, I'm sure, you can sort of work around your own body type. Like my shoulders are very narrow, as I've said before, wider hips. So I can kind of, figure out what shape is going to work well for me. Whereas if I go into a store, I find it extremely frustrating. I have to try on 50 things to find, if I'm lucky, one thing that fits. Yeah. Here I just I can make it fit. Hopefully. Yeah,
and knitting stretches. So if it's not perfect,
right,
you don't have to calculate it out to the millimeter to make it fit. It just sits properly. So that's
exactly,
that is a definite advantage. Yeah.
Okay, so it seems like you've kind of wrapped up, wound down, and maybe that's it. But
yeah, well, thank you for having me. It was really, really lot of fun.
Oh, Jules, it was really delightful and such a diversion for me, because I'm really stuck in Art Deco. Not that I don't enjoy it, but this was like, taking a trip to another planet for a little time. I will put the links that you sent me in the show notes, and people can learn more about you. It's really been fun. And
okay, great.
So
thank
you.
Say
goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.